We're good?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello. I am Tatev, and I'm here once again with Wendy, who is an organizer and community builder who works with the Justice Arts, works and has founded Justice Arts Coalition. We're at Rhizome DC Tacoma Park location in June of 2021. We had an unfortunate accident of recording Wendy's interview and the sound got lost somehow in a way, so we're going to redo this journey through all of her life, and she's thrilled for that in the shape of the oral history. So since we had like this whole thing again, I wanted to take a different angle this time and maybe begin with the story of how I met you. And that was through an exhibition here at Rhizome in 2019, where I walked into the room next to this room and I saw these beautiful paintings and these fishes created by an artist named Carol Alden. And I read her story, and it was really heart-wrenching and difficult. It was a scary story of a woman who's been through an abusive marriage and tried in many ways to protect herself and her children, and then some other things happened in her life and she was incarcerated. While in prison, she made these beautiful pieces of art, and we all got to experience it because to you, Wendy.
because Carol had connected with my organization, Justice Arts Coalition, a year or two prior to that, and we were actually functioning under a different name and kind of a different fashion at that time when Carol and I connected. But yeah, so we had launched our first exhibition here at Rhizome, all artwork by folks who were at that time incarcerated or had previously been incarcerated. I'm trying to remember. I think actually everyone in this particular exhibition was incarcerated at the time of the exhibit, except for Carol was just about to get out. Yeah. This was just before she got out. And Carol had connected with me through her mom, which is often the case. So we work with artists who are incarcerated all over the country. And oftentimes it's through their family members who are, in relationship with them and trying to support their creative work. They find my organization online, reach out to me and say, what is this Justice Arts Coalition thing all about? How can you help my loved one who's in prison and who's an artist or a writer or a songwriter, whatever. And so her mom had reached out to me, let me know that, her daughter was in prison, had been a very successful artist prior to her incarceration, which is actually kind of unique. Most of the artists who we connect with had never had any experience as artists. They discovered their talent while incarcerated and were kind of looking to grow and build it there. But she said, Carol is an exceptional artist. She did, she was exhibiting work all over the place before she went to prison, and she's trying to continue to show her work and also lay the groundwork for her to continue her career once she gets out. So I let her know about our organization and the kinds of opportunities we provided in terms of like online galleries and sharing work and connecting artists in prison with other orgs and programs that were hosting exhibitions. And it took a while. Carol will say that it was probably maybe a year or so between the first time her mom let her know about my organization and when Carol finally decided, okay, I'm going to reach out to these folks. It took that long because Carol had a number of experiences of like people on the outside saying, "Ooh, I want to help you sell your work. I want to show your work." And she would send the work out and never hear from them again. Or God. She would hear, somehow that they were, profiting off of her work, but she wasn't getting a penny. So she felt as though, her experiences had been really negative. She felt really exploited. And so it didn't, trusting yet another person who was saying like, oh yeah, I really want to support you in however you want, whatever ways you want to show your work, to sell your work. that trust was not going to come easily. So she'll say that, it took a long time of like her mom getting to know me a little bit. I wrote to her. We sent her information about the organization. And finally she reached back out to me on her own, and we started writing letters back and forth and getting to know each other. And I think, she was vetting me as she should have, just to make sure that, her work was going to be secure when she sent it out. And I completely get that. I mean, not just is it about the risk of exploitation being huge when you're in prison, because you can't see what happens when you send your stuff out into the world. But I think for artists, when they're working in that context, there's so much more vulnerability. Like they're exposing pieces of themselves that don't typically get exposed in a prison. There's the risk of what comes when other people in the prison see that. In many cases, they're using materials that they're not supposed to have, so they can get in trouble. The artwork can get taken away from them. Just the act, I think, of creating artwork while you're incarcerated is like a very, very, very beautiful act of rebellion of I'm still a person and I still have an identity and I'm going to express myself and I still have a story and I'm going to share it. It's really super courageous, I think, and a really inspiring reclaiming of identity, reclaiming of personhood, of everything having to do with humanity. But then to send that out and not know what might happen to it is a huge, huge risk.
Yeah.
So she decided to start sharing her work, and she and I built a friendship, built a connection. And like I said, she exhibited here. We had a few of her pieces, including some illustrations that you saw, and her fish house, which was so. Prior to her incarceration, Carol was doing a lot of work in textiles, creating some really large-scale installations, doing some illustrative work, but mostly working large-scale textile stuff. When she got to prison and had super limited means, very few supplies on hand, you can't just order your art supplies readily from prison. There are a lot of rules and regulations as to what you can and can't have, and those differ greatly between facilities, depending on the warden, depending on whether it's a federal or a state prison. There are so many different regulations around that. So she couldn't, she didn't have paint, she didn't have a lot of the textile stuff that she would normally have worked with. But one thing she saw other people doing that she had never done was crocheting. And she would kind of scoff. She'll say she would kind of scoff at the ladies doing their crochet work, and she's like, that's. But then she, I guess one day decided what, I can do that, and I can do it better, and I can do it my way. So she started playing with crochet, and I was actually surprised to hear that she could, because in most places you actually can't have a crochet needle.
I would imagine so.
You can't have them. They're considered contraband. They're potentially a weapon, but for whatever reason, in this particular facility she was in, that was one of the few things they could have was a crochet hook and yarn.
Wow.
So she started teaching herself to crochet, but to not just crochet, she decided that she wanted to figure out how to make crochet sculpture. So she wanted to be able to make it three-dimensional. So she began, trying to find other materials, objects she could find around the facility to build infrastructure, and then the crochet became the exterior of these sculptures that she was making. And she had this vision so Carol's always been very fascinated with sea life. She finds, I think, kind of a kinship with the resilience of deep sea fish and just their vibrance, and she can say it much better than I can when she talks about why the ocean. She lives in the desert. She lives in Utah. Yeah. Why the ocean? She talks very beautifully and eloquently about what that means for her. But she started having these visions of creating a house that was shaped as a fish, and it would a mobile, an RV that was shaped as a fish. So she started playing with these ideas of these large-scale fish dwellings. And she created, I think the first thing she created was her fish house, which I don't think you've seen. It wasn't here. You might have seen pictures of it, which was this like, this big crocheted deep sea fish, mouth open, and like it was an RV inside, kitchen, bed, like the whole thing. Amazing. And that was actually sent to exhibit at the Utah Arts and Heritage Center or something, and won a huge like statewide prize there. The other thing she created was her prison fish, which is what you saw here. Again, large scale deep sea fish, beautiful, vibrant colors, like big, huge fins and flowing tail, and big mouth, like open with bars, right? That you could look in, and the inside of the fish was her cell, was her prison cell. And it had her bunk and a little desk and a little toilet and a little shelf, and then a sculpture of herself standing, reaching out of the bars with a heart in her hands.
And it gives me goosebumps just from thinking about it.
Incredibly powerful piece of artwork. Like so much story embedded within it. And so that's what you saw here. And that was like, I think what everyone was just completely enamored with who came into that exhibit was the fish. And it had, she had also created, somehow installed a little LED light at the top. So like a ceiling fixture basically, so that it lit up. But when we got it here, it didn't work.
I remember that.
Yes,
Mike was trying to fix it.
Hours and hours and hours. And I think he finally did get it working, but we also had like little flashlights on hand just in case people couldn't see inside. But that didn't, the way she had it rigged, it just lit up the whole space. It was incredible. Carol is as much of an engineer as an artist. She's one of the most brilliant people I've ever met in my life. And her vision is like out of this, like I just don't even know how she thinks of these things, but she put this thing together. So I was saying that finally, after a few years of it being here with me, has sold. And she got out just as we were wrapping up the exhibition here. She got out and has had, so that was 2 years. She's just almost exactly 2 years since she's gotten out.
And is she making and painting as before?
She is, not as much as before, because she has really struggled to find stable housing. So she hasn't been able to create a studio space. And she's kind of been bouncing. Which is a problem I'm sure many persons coming out of that prison system experience, trying to find housing and. I mean, she's got a label, she's got a label imprinted upon her that makes it next to impossible for her to rent. And she can't leave the county because of parole. So she's stuck, and she's in Utah. It's not like there are a ton of resources there, rural. There aren't many resources. So she's had a really, really hard time. So currently she has gotten a big plot of land that she is trying to build a shelter on, but and she is going to try to build her fish house on. Like that's the goal. The plan is that she's building the fish house.
I gotta go visit her one day.
You really should. So there's actually a film crew from DC that's going to be following this process of her building her fish house.
Incredible.
And making a documentary.
I would love to send me some information about that when that's happening.
Okay. Yeah, they went out to see her in February. They're called Unchained Stories. Unchained Stories. Based in DC, and it's a documentary film group that works. All of their film work is around reentry and incarceration. Okay. So they met Carol through me, and and her plan with the fish house has been that it is mobile and that she would travel in it around the country and work with women, especially women in rural areas who are experiencing, domestic violence, interpersonal violence, doing art workshops for them, sharing her story, doing, speaking at different institutions and events, and that, the fish house would be kind of this like mobile healing space. I think she's kind of retooling that vision a little bit and thinking about this plot of land that she's purchased. I think she's purchased it as like a haven for women to come to, in order, like a sanctuary away from situations that are, that were violent, to be in community together, to make art together. Carol is very much a caregiver.
Yeah.
Very much a nurturer. She surrounds herself with critters. So she's got a big old flock of chickens and some dogs.
I've seen her roosters.
Yeah, like, and I think I see her very much as like wanting to, just wanting to nurture, right?
Yeah.
And so I think she's trying to create this very nurturing space for women who have shared experiences like hers. And it's going to take a heck of a lot of resources and time to build this up. So hopefully the film project will help bring attention to what she's doing and a lot of support for it.
Yeah. Hopefully they pay her too.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for sharing part of
that's a big part of the story.
I actually like that because I think it gives kind of a face of the mission that you're working on. And I remember from our last interview, and I want to bring this back up because I think that was a really interesting point you made last time, that to really get involved in some sort of work like this, you kind of have to have a real personal connection. So do you mind retelling that story of how you came to be interested in this kind of work?
I can try. I mean, and the story is still kind of forming for me. I'm still putting the pieces of myself together very much every day, every moment of every day. But I mean, as I look back on my own life, like one of the themes for me has always been like my own kind of search for a sense of belonging and like the sense that I like matter in the world. And I had a very hard time finding that as like a wee little person, because like I learned from my mother at a very young age that like I hadn't been planned, right? Like, well, and a lot of kids aren't planned, but the way my mother put it was basically like, we didn't want you. like she was on the pill. She let me know that she was on the pill. It failed, and I was like a result of that failure. And my father left very shortly after my birth. So as a young kid who doesn't, who can't like step back from that situation and say, okay, well that might have not had anything to do with me, and that's my mother's story, and that's her own shit, and whatever, and blah blah. For me, it was very much like, okay, so not only was I I wasn't wanted, and I'm seeing evidence around me of that too, because my mother was very disengaged and emotionally unavailable and like not present. And then my dad was like, had gone. But like, it felt very much like I was like an imposter, right? Like, and like I wasn't wanted around. And so what that kind of turned into for me was this like deep kind of magnetism to like finding the places where there were other people who had had a similar experience, and building connection with those people. And so that created, like, on one hand, a very kind of impassioned, fiery, like, activist part of me that was like wanted to learn everything about, like the impacts of like racism and systemic oppression and like all of the things, like from a very young age, like 6th, 7th grade, I started to pour. One of my older sisters was away in college and was studying sociology and like women's studies and African American studies, and I would like pour through her books and start reading, I'm like whatever I could get my hands on, and building this, the kind of this like more academic view of. I've never been super academic, but like, the book view of like, okay, what are the systemic issues at play here, and like how can I work against them, fight them? What's my narrative around all this, so that I can be like, what are my tools for fighting, for fighting the power? But at the same time that was developing, I was also finding that I needed to like immerse myself in the lives of folks who were like experiencing oppression, experiencing, all of the like, it's very hot, um, whose lives were most impacted by, by our country's like history of violence and racism and economic inequality and all of it. And so I was like finding myself drawn to these places and doing a lot of work in like soup kitchens and shelters and building relationships with the people that I met there.
When did you start that kind of work?
Okay, so after elementary school, I went to like the public elementary school in town, and the summer after I finished there, my plan was like, I'm gonna go on to the junior high with all my friends. My mother actually let me know, no, actually you're not gonna go to the junior high, you're gonna go to the snooty private school in town. And I like had my mind very, very clearly made up that that's like not where I wanted to be, nor was it where I belonged, right? I had a strong perception of like what the people at the private school were like, what the culture was gonna be like, and I wanted nothing to do with it. So that was actually that was like a breaking point in my relationship with my mother, because already it was very strained. But she knew that that's not where I wanted to be. She made the decision for me. There was no conversation, there was no choice. I didn't feel like, there was any trust in like me maybe knowing what was good for me. And so I was like kind of dragged, kicking and screaming to this school in 7th grade. And miserable, like absolutely miserable. That was also the same year that basically at the same time my mother had developed a new relationship with a man that I did not like at all. And they were to get married, and this was all kind of happening at the same time. So it was like things were crashing, around me. I'm being sent to this school. My mother's got this new person who's taking all of her attention. I could not get any. And so I'm like, so I'm at this new school. I'm freaking miserable. And
where was this then?
This is Connecticut. Mm-hmm.
I'm like, I know this story because we've talked about this, but it's just for you.
Yeah, this is Fairfield County, Connecticut. And so at some point that first year I was there, 7th grade year, I think, one of the teachers, I think I was kind of was like shut down and in my own world there, but one of the teachers decided to reach out to me and say like, hey, I go to I'm going to serve dinner at a soup kitchen every other Sunday. Why don't you come? And I'm like, I don't know what this is. I don't know what a soup kitchen is. I don't know whatever. Okay, sure. And I went, and it was like, I think that was pretty life altering for me. Not because I was well aware of the of the realities of poverty. I was well aware that just the next exit down 95, there were people who were experiencing life in a very, very different way than the people who I saw in my little bubble, especially at the private school. So it was no shock to see like, oh, people are people are really struggling. What the shift was for me was like, the comfort and ease I felt there, like with the people that I met. And one thing that I really appreciated in the way that I think it was the way that this teacher in particular, facilitated our being there. It wasn't like, oh, I've now throughout my life worked at a number of like shelters and soup kitchens and stuff like that. Oftentimes volunteers come in, they stand behind a table or behind like a counter, they hand out food, and that's it. In fact, I worked for quite a few years at the men's shelter in Rockville.
Yeah.
And volunteers would come in to serve the meals. There wasn't like a full kitchen there might be now. But volunteers would like bring in food to serve meals. And the rule was that volunteers would have to stay behind the table, hand the meal, hand the food, whatever. The guys who were staying there would just go sit in another room, and there was no intermingling, which was fucking infuriating for me. Because here I am, like someone who basically was there working at the shelter because of this experience that I had as a 7th grader, as a kid, where I was sitting down eating with folks. Like we'd hand out some food, but then we'd go, I'd sit down, I'd hang out, I'd play with kids, I'd, talk to moms, hear their stories. And it was able to build relationships so that every time I'd come, be like, oh, hey, how are you? Just, there's a relationship there. And that felt like vital to me, as opposed to like, oh, we're just here, like I'm going to serve you and leave. I'm going to do my good deed for the week and then go off and not think about you again. So when it comes to like, you know, that for me, like that's what mattering feels like. That's what belonging feels like, is like there's a deep connection there. There's time, there's space, there's presence that's like dedicated to relationship building. And that felt like so right for me, so right. And two, like a bit of a shared language. Now, given here I was like, you know, a white middle schooler who was coming from a private school in a very wealthy community, access to everything, all the material needs that I, you know, could have possibly imagined, access to a great education, whether I appreciated it or not. So I had all that, and I knew like I had a great deal of privilege in a lot of ways, that the folks I was meeting in the soup kitchen did not have, and were never going to have. Yes. And there was this shared experience of feeling invisible, and feeling as though, you know, as like someone who just didn't matter. And that's where the connection could happen, and I think that's where the trust came from too, of like we see each other. We really see each other. So that carried on with me. And as I think I told you the last time, like over the course of the next few years, like as my home life, my life in school, my personal life was really like in shambles. I was very much a severely depressed, you know, kid who really had no strong relationships. I had no adults in my life who I felt like I could really look to for consistency and support and mentorship and like safety. I have 3 older sisters, but they were gone. So I felt like super, super alone, and I think carried a lot of self-blame. So I was really self-destructive. And like living this just this very dark life. But I continued to do like service work. And that was like the light for me. That was the one thing that gave me a sense that like there was, you know, like I had a purpose in the world, and that I could, and that purpose was to make sure, you know, that other people knew, had reason to believe, even if it was just from me, that they mattered. And that there was something reciprocal in that too. Like I think I've always been aware and conscious of the complexity of and potential dangers of like, where are my needs here? Like when does this go from a genuinely safe, healthy, reciprocal, supportive, nurturing connection to like, oh, I'm actually relying on someone who is hella worse off than me to meet my needs for, you know, for mattering, for being seen, for feeling like I'm doing good in the world. So, I mean, and that's tricky. That's something that I'm always reflecting on and always looking at. And I think I've navigated it like pretty well. And I'm sure that I'm sure that I'm missing things at times too. But it really, so that like carried me. I think that's probably why I survived high school, was because I was doing that work, because everything else was in complete fucking shambles all around me. Yeah. But I could, you know, go whatever. I would, you know, do my service work, and that was like the only time I was like clean and sober, and like the only time I was like present with myself, and felt self-connected, and also felt like real, genuine, deep connection with other people.
So you graduate high school.
Somehow. I don't barely. Yes. Oh, and the other thing that we talked about last time that we didn't talk about this time was that at some point early in high school, I think it was 9th or 10th, I think it was 9th grade, I started writing to someone who was incarcerated.
How did that happen?
So there was a...
You need a break?
There was a letter to the editor in our little hometown newspaper from a young man who was incarcerated in Michigan. I have no idea how it ended up in like the Greenwich, Connecticut newspaper. But there it was. You know, I think he was like 16 at the time, and he just wrote like, I can someone write to me? Like, will people please write to me? I'm like, here, I'm lonely, I don't have family. Someone write to me. And so, you know, me, of course, I'm like, oh yes, well, of course I'm going to write to you. So I did, and we developed friendship. And so he was, just a year or two older than me. He was in an adult prison, and had, you know, kind of like very disrupted relationship with family. So it was very much on his own. And, you know, like we connected kind of from that place. And this, you know, was my first experience of being in direct relationship with someone who is incarcerated, and beginning to understand what that experience was like.
Can you tell me like a little bit what stood out to you from your conversations with this person?
It's tough, you know, it was a long time ago, so I don't like, and actually still somewhere the letters still exist, but I think I just really felt like there was a deep empathy for that sense of isolation. I think that's what it, you know, like I really felt that, like not only is he in like locked in a fucking cell, you know, with no access to any of kind of the like creature comforts that one needs, like no control over his environment whatsoever, no control over when, you know, might be able to go outside, see sunlight, get fresh air, when he eats, when he drinks, when he sleeps, when he, you know what I mean, like that, like the idea of just losing all of that agency, all of that, like all of the relationships, and then that complete disconnect from family, and having nobody reaching out to like try to support, to care. So that, you know, like that, I think touched something super, super deep in me. And there was like anger, you know, like I think that started boiling up, like real anger inside of me, that we would treat anyone, and I still, like to this day, like I don't believe that anyone deserves that.
How did that anger then materialize into the world after the fact?
I mean, I don't think it materialized in very productive ways at that point in my life, right? It materialized in a lot of very fiery like arguments with my mother, I think it also fueled, but it fueled my path very much. It fueled my path into the work that I do now. It fueled again, like when I did, you know, when I left college and when I left high school and started college, like there was no other path for me other than like the work that I had already been, other than like social services. I didn't know how to do anything else. This was it. Like, so I went to college, I majored in sociology like my sister had. And I knew that I would be doing something that was social work oriented.
But you were saying that something about social work when you actually were in field still was not right.
Was not
Can you
it.
tell me a little bit about that?
It took me a long time to figure it out. So like multiple jobs in social service agencies, like nonprofit social service agencies, doing like case management, working in residential treatment centers for youth. It was very, very difficult for me to adapt myself to and be compliant with. The social service agencies, they like to throw around the term compliant a lot. People are supposed to be compliant, like people seeking their services are supposed to be compliant with a lot of rules in order to deserve their services. But staff are also supposed to be compliant, and I'm not by nature compliant, like I think, and there were, the structures of these organizations were so hierarchical, and the ways that we were supposed to approach the people who came to us seeking support felt so kind of like inhumane to me and dehumanizing and like disconnected from like the reality of human needs to me.
What was the disconnect? Can you?
There was this, it's really still hard for me to articulate, but the relationship was never front and center.
Yeah.
Trust was never front and center.
Yeah.
Care, like even like I'd never heard the word care, you know, like care was not front and center. It was like, you know, Wendy, you're the case manager, like I'm supposed to know what this person needs better than they know, and make them comply to what I think they need. And if they don't, then they can't. Then they have to go away because then they don't deserve the services that we're offering. And because because I went to school, because I was trained, whatever, I'm supposed to just know these things. And it was never about like meeting someone human to human, and like connecting first from that place. It was never about belonging. It was never about like
visibility,
yes, people need to feel seen. People need to feel heard. People need to feel like they matter, but that's not. It was very super diminishing of those very, to me, core, very basic human needs. Basic human like emotional needs and needs for any level of fulfillment.
Yeah.
And so I was like always fighting against that. Constantly fighting against that. And I was like constantly in trouble because just the way I approached relationship with people was like not within those bounds. And that didn't go over well. I don't know, like because people liked me and felt comfortable talking to me, like, and wanted, and I could just kind of shoot the shit with folks who were called clients. That was threatening, I guess, in some ways, to like administrators, whatever. And so yeah, it was like constantly like the squeaky wheel. I was always in trouble. And because I would say, like, if I saw someone getting treated in a way that felt unjust to me, I would say it, like, and I'd make a racket, and that didn't go over well, right? You don't want to question, you're not supposed to question those systems.
Yeah.
And I was also seeing, the way the systems were like pulling people in and churning them out, and they were coming through and through and through. So like, folks at the shelter, right? Cycling from the shelter back to the street, to the hospital, to the jail, back to the shelter, back to the street, to the hospital, to the jail, or like in any kind of order. And I'm like, what do we do? How are we not perpetuating this? Like, what are we going to do to not perpetuate this cycle? What are we going to do to actually, like enable people to thrive? Yeah. Clearly we're doing something wrong.
So how did you go about doing that?
I don't know that I've done that, but what I decided to do, I started getting really interested in restorative justice.
Yeah.
And studying restorative justice and learning about restorative practices. And to me, that felt like a really exciting possibility of like, oh, wow, like the justice can look like something other than just throwing someone away. And that actually doesn't look like justice or feel like justice to me, right? So that's not what justice is to me. And I, learning about restorative justice, like the way that it actually did center relationship and did center healing. And there wasn't really, like I think I've always been really uncomfortable with anything punitive, with anything retributive. I knew looking back on my own life, that those things never worked for me. Like they never taught me anything. They never helped me heal. When I was creating all kinds of havoc, I'd get in trouble or whatever. Like that's not what I needed. What I needed was someone to draw me in closer and say, what happened? Like what's going on? I care. And I was seeing in restorative processes that, what mattered was like people's stories and like what happened to them as a result of, a harm that's been done. And I saw so much potential for like how that could create new structures and systems outside of our carceral system that could be a model for something completely new. And something that, well, it's not, it's a very, very old process. These are very old processes, but something that's, that's like the kind of polar opposite of the way that we handle conflict and harm, in our societies. So I got really curious about that, and ended up going to grad school to study conflict transformation. And when I got to school, I discovered that they had a program that was focused on kind of the role of the arts in peace building and conflict transformation. And I didn't know that was like a thing, that even existed. And so I was like, boom. And that's kind of where I ended up focusing my studies in grad school. And that landed me, I'd always had kind of a pull towards working with folks who were incarcerated. I had seen a movie when I was in like my early 20s called Slam, which is a phenomenal movie about a young guy, poet, who gets locked up and kind of like uses his poetry to like transcend that experience of being incarcerated. And in the film, there's a poetry teacher at who offers a class at the jail. They connect, and I was like, I can't write a poem for shit, but I want to be that teacher. So I knew that like I had that little seed in me when I got to grad school, and then as I started looking into different ways that I could bring kind of this interest in restorative justice and the arts together, I decided like, oh, let me go facilitate a creative writing group at a jail, and I did that. And that's like what kind of launched me on this path towards what is now a nonprofit organization. When I finished grad school, I moved here to DC, and the hope was that I would find work in an organization that was somehow doing like arts-based work in prisons or doing restorative justice work. And so came here to DC, kind of not where I wanted to be. I'm still here for some reason, but that is definitely not where I wanted to be. But my partner at the time had found a really cool job for himself and thought that this would be a great place for me to find work.
Washington, D.C.
In D.C.
Yeah.
Yeah. We had been in Albuquerque prior to that for a year. That's where I was teaching in the jail. And so we got here, and I could not, for the fucking life of me, find a job, which was really, really discouraging. It was the first time in my life that I had like not been able to find a job. It was also the first time in my life living in like a major metropolitan area where there's a lot more competition for jobs. The place I had lived the longest prior to this was in like a small town in Alaska. There wasn't a whole lot of competition for jobs.
I think you're also looking for a very
particular kind of job, and there weren't a lot of opportunities in that area. So I expanded the search. You know, my goal was just to not have to go back to doing social services work, because I didn't go to grad school to go back and do the same thing.
Yeah.
But so during this job search, which became more and more disheartening, I was sending out like dozens of resumes, cover letters every day, and learning that in most cases people don't even respond when you do that. I started doing just like a little bit of writing for the change.org website, which at that time, so this was like 2009, 2010, at that time they were actually like, they had multiple pages on their site that were dedicated to different kinds of issues, and they had one that was dedicated to all things related to kind of to incarceration and like carceral justice. And so I proposed to them, I met one of the editors from there, I don't remember how, and proposed to them, like, could I write a series of articles on like restorative justice and arts-based programs in prisons? And they were like, okay, sure. So I was just doing that. But through that, I became familiar with a woman named Judith Tannenbaum, who was a poet who had been teaching in prisons in California for years and years and years, and had co-written a memoir with one of her students who was still in prison about their experience as student and teacher in a prison. And was introduced to Judith so that I could interview her for an article about the book. And Judith had, a couple of years prior, along with some of her fellow teaching artists who worked in prisons in other parts of the country, had launched a website that was called the Prison Arts Coalition. And it was a kind of just like an online resource for information about arts programs in prisons, a place where you could look at creative work made by incarcerated folks, read. There was a blog where the teaching artists were writing about their experiences, and a directory of arts programs in prisons across the country. And it was a really cool online resource that I had actually tapped into a little bit for my research when I was in grad school. And so as I got to know Judith, who's this amazing, amazing human being, she and I, like, very much kindred spirits, kind of started developing a friendship. She, seeing my yearning to be more deeply involved in this work, of making sure that folks inside in prison had opportunities to express themselves creatively, to share their stories, to share their artwork,
to the outside world.
with the outside world, and connect with people on the outside world through that. she was like, well, you know, and that I couldn't, like, she knew, like, I could not, for the life of me, I couldn't find work doing that. She said, you know, like, the other teaching artists and I who started this website, like, we are all really busy and we don't have time to, like, really manage the site in the way that it needs to be. And there was, like, an email account associated with it, and, you know, it just required some work. And she said, would you be able to, you know, do you want to volunteer? We don't have any money. It's not like an organization or anything. It's just a website. Would you want to volunteer to help us with it? So I absolutely jumped on that, because I realized it was a way for me to begin to, like, get a better understanding of the whole field, of, like, what, you know, learn from these teaching artists who'd been doing this work a lot longer than I had, share information, you know, bring some visibility to the value of the work that they were doing, and the, you know, immense amount of incredible creative work that was happening inside of prisons all over the country. So I started to do that just as a volunteer, and, like, kind of build the website, build out the social media associated with it, start really, like, diving into, you know, connecting with people via email, and shortly thereafter I ended up going back to work in the social services because it was the only place I could find a job, but kept managing this thing as a volunteer on the side.
What was this thing called?
It was called the Prison Arts Coalition website.
Okay.
Yeah. And kind of over the next few years, I saw as, like, more and more people were, like, visiting the site, emailing for information about, like, oh, how do I start an arts program in my local prison? Or how do I connect my loved one who's incarcerated with opportunities to show their work? Or, you know, oh, I'm writing an article for school or for a magazine or whatever about incarcerated artists or about arts programs that are in prisons. You know, can you give me information? So, like, the email was starting to get busier and busier, and there was, like, more and more people in prison writing to me saying, hey, you know, here's my artwork, sending me their artwork. Can you share this? Can you sell it? Can you exhibit it? Whatever you do, help. So all of this attention, you know, started getting paid to this work. And I don't know, like, over the course of a few years, there began to be conversations among especially teaching artists who were really dedicating their lives to, like, you know, making sure that there was access in prisons to, you know, all kinds of arts programs and classes. For there to be some sort of, like, every teaching artist I ever talked to who worked in a prison was like, I know there are people out there doing similar work as me, but I don't know how to stay connected with them. Like, I feel like there's no one who I can talk to who understands the challenges of, like, being a teaching artist who works in a prison. Like, there's so many intricacies and so many boundaries to navigate and rules to navigate, and it's hellish. And, like, the heart, you know, the way that you carry in your heart, like, when you're working with people inside, at the end of the day, you get to leave, they don't, like, it's really, really hard work. And so there was this call for, like, we need some way to stay connected across the field. And folks started talking about the idea of there being, like, a national organization that would do that, that would keep people who are involved in this work, deeply involved in this work, connected. Like, between, you know, there'd be, like, a conference every couple of years, and everyone would see each other and be like, ooh, here are my people, you know, and then they'd leave and they wouldn't talk again for 2 years, and they'd feel really isolated and like, alone in their work. So that's where the idea for the Justice Arts Coalition started coming from. It was, like, just talking with mostly, you know, teaching artists who were working in prisons of, like, we need something to keep us glued together. And then my work through my volunteering through the Prison Arts Coalition website was connecting me with all of these incarcerated folks across the country, with their family members, you know, their friends, their partners, all other kinds of people who were, like, really invested and involved in making sure that, you know, that, like, that there were opportunities for these arts programs inside. There were opportunities for incarcerated folks to, like, have their work seen in the way that it deserves to be. And so I, you know, kind of my vision coming into it was like, yes, what I'm hearing from teaching artists is there needs to be something that's kind of akin to, like, a professional network. But what I'm seeing is that there's a need for something that's vaster than that, that, like, holds all of these different people who are working around this intersection of the arts and incarceration as kind of equals in the same space. so that there can be, exchange, and because there's like interdependence there. Like the teaching artists can't exist on an island without being in communication with and constantly learning from, incarcerated artists.
Yeah.
And in order for that to happen, we need family members invested and loved ones invested. And we need, resources. So we need folks from universities invested, and we need just members of the general public who the more and more members of the general public we get to understand, the experiences of people in prison and to give a shit about the experiences of people in prison, the more likely we are to have people working for change and demanding change, right? So thinking about ways of how do we directly connect people inside and outside through the arts. So we started a pen pal program that was arts focused. And we started doing the exhibitions where we're encouraging people who come to the exhibitions to write down their feedback, their reflections that we then send to the artists, so that there's a real contact there. There's a real connection being made there. And so for me, what my vision of Justice Arts Coalition was it was this hub that was creating kind of community, creating a web of connectedness between people inside, outside of prison that were involved in all kinds of different aspects of whether it was directly teaching art or involved in art, or just activism around, around ending mass incarceration, bringing them all together into this giant community. And that seems to be what's happening. So that was 2.5 years ago, started the process of kind of transforming what was this Prison Arts Coalition website into a national nonprofit organization that brings everybody together in this space.
What does it look like today?
Crazy.
Take your time.
It looks like almost 400 incarcerated folks who share their work with us, who we connect with folks outside through, I said, the partner project is our pen pal program. We have events, Art Links events, where they used to happen here at Rhizome before the pandemic, and maybe they can happen here again, where there's just one-off. We bring a bunch of new artwork that's been sent to us by folks inside, and invite community members to come and spend some time one evening with that artwork, and then choose a couple pieces that really speak to them, write their thoughts, reflections, feelings down in letters to the artists that we send to the artists.
That's beautiful.
And then oftentimes the artists, almost all the time, artists will write back. Sometimes that launches an ongoing exchange, sometimes it doesn't. Mm-hmm. It looks like exhibitions. The year before the pandemic, our first was here at Rhizome, and then we had multiple exhibitions after that. We had to cancel a bunch because of the pandemic.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about how you came to Rhizome, how that group came to Rhizome, and what about the space felt accommodating of all places to choose this little house to host that big first exhibition there?
Sure. So my first visit to Rhizome was for a letter writing night. Mm-hmm. I don't remember what the specific context was, but it was someone was organizing a campaign that involved writing letters to people in prison. I think it was political prisoners. And I saw a flyer somewhere, and I was like, I want to go do that. Maybe I'll meet some cool people. And what is this Rhizome place? Mm-hmm. And that first night I came, I walked in, it was just a few people sitting around folding tables downstairs, super lax, super just chill, and writing letters together, snacking, and I just immediately felt completely at home here. I have my own visions for creating spaces like this, art spaces and spaces for community and creativity, and for me, this felt, when I walked into Rhizome, everything felt very, very familiar.
I can relate to that.
And there was there's just no pretense, right? There's no bullshit here. And that's the kind of space that I'm always yearning. I have been yearning for my entire life. And it's something that I think I found pretty readily when I was living in Alaska, but haven't really been able to find anywhere else.
Oh, wow.
And so actually what I've said it to Lane, I think, this Rhizome is the closest to Alaska that I can get without getting on a plane.
And Alaska is the dream.
It's just, it's not necessarily the dream. I mean, I was there for 5 years. It just helped build my idea of what what like community is supposed to feel like.
And what
feel like.
What can it feel like?
I think it's just like being able to strip a lot away. Like strip away a lot of the, I don't know, like the walls between us and the like niceties and the pretty and the but and just like to me it looks like
it just is.
It's not even what it looks like, it's what it feels like, right? And there's just I don't know, there's just this comfort to me in simplicity, in things being somewhat bare bones, in it's authenticity. There's an authenticity, and that's what I found in Alaska too, to the people and to the spaces and to we're not trying to be anything, you know, we're not trying to be anything we're not trying to be more than we're this and this is enough and this is.
Does that feel safe? Is that how you would define like safe? And I'm kind of exploring this concept of open and safe spaces.
Yes. Yeah. Because you walk into a space like this and it beckons like just. I think the message it gives back to you is like this is enough. Like just be. It's okay to just be you. Yeah. You know, you don't have to pretend to be anything else.
Was that kind of a feeling part of the reason why you wanted to host that first
Absolutely.
big exhibition?
Oh, it was like a given. It was a given. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let's talk about that exhibition.
It was just I mean, it was it was the first opportunity to really embed the work of the organization here locally. It was like our coming out event.
Yeah.
And I couldn't imagine a better place to do it, right?
Tell me a little bit about
it felt
that
aligned with me.
Yeah.
It felt aligned with like the energy of the artists and the artist's work. It was just the ease, the comfort, the support that I felt, like when I started talking with Lane and other people that I was meeting at Rhizome about the exhibition, and like the amount of people who were like, oh, I want to help, you know, like, I help install, whatever. It was just like, I knew that here, anybody who came to, you know, engage with the exhibition and spend time with the artwork was going to be here for the right reasons, and was like genuinely, legitimately going to care about the stories that they were experiencing, and, you know, and like be open to it. Yeah. Be open.
How was the opening night?
It was amazing.
What did you do? Tell me about it.
I thought it was going to be tiny. I honestly thought like I was going to be very happy if we could get like 25 people here. And we had like flyers all over town and whatever, but I wasn't seeing, you know, a huge response. I had no idea. I didn't know what to expect. We had lined up music. We had lots of food donations and tons of beer from 3 Stars, you know, like tons of beer. I don't know why we had so much beer. And it turned out there were like over 100 people in and out of here that night. And the place was packed. And there was, you know, like one of the artists, basically like half his family was here because he's from Washington State but has family locally. So his grandpa, who he hadn't seen in years and years, who's also an artist, who's in his 90s, you know, was here, and, you know, kind of his, like, this particular artist's work was upstairs. Grandpa made it up the stairs, and we like plopped him down on some chairs right in front of his grandson's work, and it was like the first time, I think, in a long time that like Grandpa had reason to feel proud of his grandson.
Beautiful.
You know, and like we could see that. And like really lifted up, and it just felt very familial. It felt very like, it just so deeply communal, the experience. Like it just felt, even though I didn't know, you know, 3/4 of the people here, everyone just felt like friends that night. Yeah. Everyone just felt like friends. We were just here together.
Exhibition stayed for how long?
Was it a month? Just about a month. So. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was so sweet, and everyone was so curious, and you know, like just wanting to know more and more about the artists and what their experiences were like, and so many people kind of stayed connected with us after that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
What
it's
are
just, like,
your
the most welcoming.
It is.
You
So
know?
now that the house will be leaving,
Mhm.
it'll be moving physically to the end of the lot, and we'll be looking into the future and recording some stories so that we can make wise choices as we move into the future.
Mhm.
I want to hear your hopes and dreams for what's next for Rhizome.
Yeah, like I want it to not change. Not change much. I mean, change can be okay, right? A little growth can be okay, like a little more space can be okay, whatever. But and I trust that, like, the energy that is Rhizome is not going to change.
Mm-hmm.
Like a shift in location isn't going to change that at all.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like the heart of the people that are building the space, that are, you know, that are like infusing their energy into the space, and that doesn't change.
Yeah.
So it's just keep doing the same damn thing. And that's it. Like I don't. Yeah, and I don't have worries about that.
Perfect.
I don't think.
I hope there will be more exhibitions from
Well,
incarcerated artists.
yeah, I would love to do that.
Yeah. Even until while the house is here, until the
Mhm.
end of the year, you should try to do some
I
stuff
know.
here.
I know. I need to talk to Lane about it, and then we can start doing our Art Links events one night a month or something. So there's lots of opportunity now that things are opening up, and we have our local, like, team of Justice Arts Coalition folks is bigger, and we can have more people.
Mostly volunteer folks, right?
All volunteer.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. I think I'm good with my questions, and much appreciating your willingness to do this over again. And I think we kind of took different paths.
A little bit,
But
And now I'm wishing that we had them both, and you could, like, patch them together and maybe have one
that would
good,
be-
clean, concise thing instead of me just, like,
One
rambling.
day when we're rich, we're gonna